In the last video, we looked at how the USA had expanded west in this period 1840 to 1860. And before we look at who the white settlers were who were expanding the country west, I'd like to pause and I'd like to look instead at who were the indigenous people of the west. Now, that means we're going to look at the Native Americans. Now, this lesson and this video uses the term indigenous people, and from that I mean the people who were originally on that land, and many of those people had been there for centuries. But we could have used a lot of other different terms because these people are known by a lot of different terms, and it's important you realise that they're known by different terms because those might crop up in a book you're reading or in the exam you're going to sit. So sometimes in these videos we've used the words Native Americans. Other people refer to them as American Indians. Sometimes these people are referred to as the Plains Indians because they are on the plains, the Great Plains of the USA. But sometimes they're also known as their specific tribe names. So sometimes you might see these people called the Sioux, and you might even get these people calling them by their tribe name the Lakota, which we will also do in this video. But the thing you need to remember is that these are the indigenous people. They were the people who were originally in this land. And I'd like to look at who these people were. Now, if you remember back to the last video, we said that the West was the region west of the Mississippi River, which cuts down the middle of the USA here, all the way over to the Atlantic coast. And in particular, in this video, I'd like to look at the indigenous people of the plains. And the plains were really the region from kind of near the Mississippi over to where the Rocky Mountains are there on the kind of left of your screen. And there were a lot of different nations of Native Americans in this region. An awful lot. You can see some here, from the Blackfoot right in the north all the way down to the Creek and the Cherokee, who we obviously were part of the 5 civilized tribes who had moved from the southeast into their new territory. And I've purposely here used the word nation and not tribes because these were sovereign states of people. These were nations of people who were distinctly different in terms of their culture. Now, all of the nations of the Native Americans in that region of the plains were all quite different in terms of their language, their culture and their traditions, but there were some things that were quite similar. Most of them relied on the buffalo that you can see pictured here, and the buffalo roamed the plains at this time in their absolute millions, in huge herds that would herd across those great plains, eating the grass and stampeding across it. Now, most of those Native Americans at this time hunted on horseback, some did not. But by the 19th century, they were also often using guns that they had bought from Europeans, in addition to the more traditional use of bow and arrow. Some of those nations had also begun trading buffalo meat and hides with each other, and importantly with the settlers who were moving into the plains regions. Many of the nations that we will look at were nomadic, and nomadic is one of those really important keywords we use. And nomadic means that the people moved around. They did not live in one permanent place, but they moved their people and their villages around, and they did that because they were hunting the buffalo across the plains, so they would move their people to be where the buffalo were. But some of those nations were not nomadic, and some of them were sedentary, and that means that they stayed in one place, and those people often, rather than hunting buffalo, grew crops on the plains. So there are lots of different nations of Native Americans that we could have looked at. But I'd really like to look at one in depth, and one that's probably the most famous of the Native American nations, and that's the Lakota. And the Lakota are also known as different names, and you might see these people sometimes referred to as the Sioux. But Sioux, some people think, is a derogatory term because Sioux in some languages means little snakes. So instead we're going to use the term that these people would like to be known as, and that's the Lakota. Now the Lakota originally were actually from this region on the very northern tip of the Great Plains, near the Great Lakes. And before the 1830s, this is where they'd lived. But from the 1780s, other Native Americans were moving into their land. So those Native Americans who we came across in the first few of these videos, who were moving west because the white settlers had moved into their region, were now moving into the Lakota region. And as a result, the Lakota moved. And really, by 1830s, they had moved completely from this region near the Great Plains into this region here called the Black Hills, and that's now in the state of Dakota. This is a picture of the Black Hills, and the Black Hills are immensely important to the Lakota, and you need to remember that because this will come back in another video. And in this move, in making this move, the Lakota moved from being a farming nation, and they stopped doing that, and they now become a nomadic nation following those buffalo herds. And in this Black Hills region, they trade with the settlers, and they gain horses, and they gain guns, and using those two things, they were able to hunt buffalo really successfully. And the Lakota become very famous and well known for their horse skills. And buffalo are crucial to the existence of this group of people. They provide food from the meat that they hunt from the buffalo. They provide shelter and clothes from the fur that they take from the buffalo. And even sometimes they provide a drink when they drink their blood when the water ran low. And when the Lakota hunted buffalo, they used every single part of it. And as a result, actually only a few buffalo hunts per year would give the Lakota enough to survive. The men of the Lakota nation would even perform a buffalo dance. Here you can see them dressed up as buffalo, dancing. And that dance was called to the spirit world for a successful hunt, and it could often last several days before they would then go out and hunt the buffalo. And you can already get the idea that the Lakota had a different kind of belief system. They believed in a great spirit, Wakantanka, and they believed that everything was connected in nature, and this is one of their spiritual men. And they believed that all living things had their own spirit, and all of their own spirit came from the earth. And as a result, for the Lakota, they believed that no one could own land. No one could own land and say that is ours. The land was itself, and it was part of this idea of being the great spirit. And the Lakota also saw around them in nature that lots of things were circular, and as a result, circles form a very important part of their identity and their traditions, and you can often see that in the clothes that they wore and the jewellery that they wore. And Lakota families lived in circular houses, teepees, and those teepees were buffalo hide that was stretched over poles. And teepees were perfect because they kept you warm in the winter months and cool in the summer months. And they were perfect for a nomadic life as they were quick to put up and to take down. And family was very important to the Lakota. And children were valued and old people were respected for their wisdom. Now the Lakota are made up of lots of different tribes, and even within that tribe they're made up of lots of different bands. And each tribe or each band sometimes had its own chief, but there was never an overall leader of the Lakota tribes collectively together. And this meant that when the US government, who do move into this region in this period, as we've already talked about, try and make treaties with these tribes, some of them follow the rules and others refuse because they are not necessarily a united group of people. They were also involved in war, and the Lakota were fierce rivals with other Native American nations. And in this picture you can see a war council where this tribe are grouping together to talk about how they're going to go to war with another group of Native Americans. And they fought other Native Americans for horses and control of those key buffalo hunting grounds that were fundamental to their existence. And really, by the start of the period where we're entering into, in 1840 to 1860, the Lakota are far and away the strongest tribe on the plains, and they are the strongest tribe because of their horse riding skills. Now, this really brings us to this question of, if we're looking at the indigenous people of the plains, well, what words should we use to describe those people? The white settlers who tried to move in the 1840s would have used words like this: savages, uncivilized. To me, those words don't apply to these people. Yes, they are different culturally from the white settlers who are moving in, but that does not mean that they did not have civilization. It does not mean that they were savage. They just behaved differently. But it's these people, these indigenous people of the West, that really do suffer at the hands of the white settlers moving in. And some people actually argue this is much more serious than that. And if you look at the numbers, in 1800, the estimated population of Native Americans was 600,000. Skip forward 100 years, and that population had dwindled to only 300,000. And some people, some historians, now actually say this is a genocide. That there's a genocide of these indigenous people throughout this period. And so that's why I wanted to start with the indigenous people before we look at the white settlers, because it's important to think about the people that were already in these regions before other people started moving in.